The ocean around the damaged battleship moved with the slow heaviness of early morning tide. The ship floated unevenly, its starboard side settling a few inches deeper with every passing minute. From a distance, the vessel still looked intact and powerful, its armored hull rising above the swells like a fortress. But below the waterline, out of sight to everyone except the divers and engineers, a growing injury threatened to end the ship's life before noon. The blast had come unexpectedly, shaking the entire forward section. Some believed it was a drifting mine. Others suspected the faint wake of a submarine that never surfaced again. The truth hardly mattered. What mattered now was the spreading fracture near the forward magazine. Steel plates once locked tight had peeled back, leaving a jagged opening where seawater surged in with steady force. Pumps worked at full speed but struggled to keep up. The volume entering the ship increased with every shift in the hull's weight. Damage control teams reported the same verdict repeatedly. If the lake continued at its current rate, the battleship would reach a fatal flooding level in less than an hour. Above the waterline, officers walked briskly across the deck, their faces tense but focused. No one was panicking. The crew of a battleship did not panic easily, but even the most seasoned among them knew the severity of the situation. The ship was too far from harbor, too deep in contested waters, and too reliant on its own crew to keep it alive. If the hull breach expanded, there would be no rescue ships near enough to intervene. The vessel would slowly list, roll, and disappear beneath the swells it had dominated only hours earlier. Below, in the cramped, dimly lit compartment adjacent to the forward magazine, divers prepared their equipment. Their suits were heavy, reinforced for work in dangerous conditions. The man leading the team moved with deliberate calm. He was not the highest-ranking diver in the Navy, nor the most decorated, nor the strongest, but he was the one the engineers trusted most when something seemed impossible. He had an unusual talent for understanding the movement of water, the behavior of pressure, and the way metal failed under stress. And he had one advantage the others did not: a willingness to attempt repairs others would walk away from. He inspected the tools laid out before him: weighted clamps, improvised steel plates, resin compounds, canvas-backed emergency patches, and reinforced bracing straps designed to hold a temporary seal in place long enough for internal repairs to begin. But none of these solutions were ideal. The breach was wider than expected. The edges were bent outward and irregular. The inward pull of water made it nearly impossible to anchor a patch. The engineers proposed a controlled flooding maneuver to equalize pressure, but this would risk destabilizing the forward magazine. Another option was to weld a plate over the breach, but the water flow was too strong for welding torches to operate. The pumps bought time, but not enough. Every minute counted, and every minute lost reduced the list of viable options. He studied the diagrams taped to the bulkhead. They showed the exact shape of the hull section where the steel had buckled. A deep inward crease formed the path of the blast's energy. The diver placed a finger on the outline of the breach. He traced the sharp interior bend, imagining the shape below the surface. With each pass of his hand, the solution formed more clearly. He turned to the engineers and gave his recommendation. It was unconventional, bordering on reckless. Instead of fighting the pressure of incoming seawater, he would use that same pressure to hold a specially shaped patch in place. The current would press the material inward, sealing the breach long enough for the clamps to anchor it. But this required the diver to position the patch manually, underwater, in conditions where visibility would be near zero. The force of the water could easily throw him off position or pull the patch out of his hands before it was secured. The engineers hesitated. The method violated standard procedures. No diver was supposed to be that close to an active, unrestrained hull breach. The suction created by inflowing seawater could pin a man against the metal with crushing force, but there were no alternatives left. The diver adjusted his equipment, checked his oxygen lines, and signaled that he was ready. He descended through a small access opening near the forward bilge. The water was cold enough to bite through his suit within seconds, and the darkness below settled around him like a solid weight. His floodlight cut a narrow path through the debris drifting around the hull. Tiny flecks of metal, splinters of insulation, and silt particles swirled in chaotic spirals. The breach came into view slowly, like a dark wound in the ship's side. Water rushed inward in a constant stream, creating twisting currents that pulled anything nearby toward the opening. The diver observed the movement without rushing. He understood that the behavior of the water was just as important as the shape of the hull. He reached out and felt along the edge of the tier, his gloves tracing the bent metal. The steel was sharper than expected, jagged enough to slice through ordinary canvas patches. He would need to position the reinforced material with precision. He retrieved the patch from the pouch strapped to his leg and unfolded it carefully. Its structure was rigid at the center but flexible at the edges, designed to adapt to warped metal. As he approached the breach, he positioned himself slightly below the opening, using the downward current to stabilize his movement. He had practiced maneuvers like this dozens of times, but never in conditions this extreme. The force of the water increased as he moved closer. The suction pulled the patch toward the opening before he was ready to position it. He shifted his angle, bracing one boot against a protruding section of hull, anchoring his weight. The patch fluttered violently in his hands, the current pressing it inward. He waited until the movement stabilized, counting the rhythm of the water flow. The ship groaned faintly above him as internal stresses shifted. He held the patch's reinforced center directly over the breach and let the suction pull it into place. It snapped against the metal with force. The edges whipped outward in the current, but the main body held. He moved quickly, fastening the lower clamps first, then the upper ones. The pressure of the water helped hold the material flush against the steel as he secured the straps. For a moment he feared the force would rip the clamps free, but the patch held. The flow of water decreased sharply, dropping from a surge to a controlled trickle. The diver exhaled slowly. The worst was over. He reinforced the edges with additional strapping, tightening each one until the vibration of incoming water stopped completely. Above him, the pumps began to gain ground for the first time since the blast. The ship's tilt stabilized. Instruments showed a reduction in flooding. Damage control crews reported that internal pressure could be managed. The diver remained in position, inspecting the edges of the patch to ensure it did not shift. The patch clung tightly, supported by the very pressure that had threatened the ship minutes earlier. He returned to the access point and ascended slowly. When he surfaced inside the bilge compartment, the engineers immediately checked the gauges. The breach was sealed. The battleship was no longer sinking. The diver removed his helmet, water streaming down his suit onto the metal deck. He said nothing. The engineers didn't comment either. Everyone knew how close the ship had come to disaster. They also knew that the maneuver he performed was the kind of solution that existed only in theory until someone was willing to attempt it. The ship's commander received the report moments later. The message was simple. The leak was contained. The battleship would survive the transit. But the full story of what happened in the dark water below the hull and the improvised maneuver that made the difference would spread through the crew long before any formal account was written. The diver rested quietly, knowing the temporary patch would hold long enough for the ship to reach safer waters. The dangerous part was over, but the story of the 5-minute repair that saved a battleship had just begun. The cold water pressed against his suit as he descended along the battleship's hull, the faint hum of generators vibrating through the steel. The surface tension of the ocean gave way to a heavy silence as he dropped below 10 feet, then 20, then 30. The world narrowed to the soft hiss of his air supply and the rhythmic sound of his own heartbeat. Floodlights mounted above cast pale beams downward, but they faded quickly in the swirling mix of sand and oil drifting around the ship. In that underwater haze, the battleship looked wounded, its armor plating twisted inward, a jagged impact point where the explosion had torn the metal apart. Water rushed through the breach with a steady force, pulling debris into the opening and sucking the ship lower by the minute. He reached the edge of the rupture and steadied himself with a gloved hand on the cold steel. The vibration was stronger here, pulsing like a heartbeat through the hull. Damage control teams topside were pumping out water as fast as possible, but he could feel the imbalance. The ship was losing the fight. He adjusted the tools clipped to his belt. The emergency patch, an experimental pressure plate reinforced with a flexible sealing frame, was folded at his side like a collapsed metal wing. It was never intended for a wound this size. It was meant for small fractures, quick repairs, temporary containment. But right now, it was the only thing standing between the ship and the ocean floor. He moved closer to the torn section. Oil residue drifted past like black smoke underwater, and fragments of paint and metal fluttered in the current. He swept his hand across the hull, clearing a space large enough for the patch to sit flush. The current tugged at his arm every few seconds, an unspoken warning of how much force the water was pushing through the ship. He signaled upward with his light. The support crew responded by lowering a weighted tether line. It sank toward him slowly, swaying, carrying the tools he needed. When it reached him, he clipped the line into his harness and secured the final 2 clamps around his wrist mount. He checked the breech again. The opening wasn't uniform, it spiraled inward like a torn hatch. Edges curled outward in some places, inward in others. The pressure difference made the water flow violently. It meant the patch would have to fight not only the ocean, but also the internal suction of flooded compartments. For a moment he hovered there, suspended in the shifting light, studying the geometry of the breach. The ship seemed to breathe, expanding, contracting, groaning under the strain. He knew the crew above was waiting for any sign of progress. Pumps were running full power. Damage control officers were tracking compartment pressure second by second. Every delay pushed the ship closer to the tipping point. He placed his hand on the hull one more time, centered himself, and began the motion he had rehearsed dozens of times but never under conditions like this. He unfolded the patch with a steady grip, letting it flare out into its rigid frame. The sealing membrane flexed in the current, shimmering like a sheet of metal skin. He positioned himself directly before the breach and angled the patch toward it. The water fought him immediately, pulling the patch sideways, dragging it offline. He tightened his grip and adjusted his orientation, pressing his fins against the hull to anchor his body. The next part had to be perfect. He braced his shoulders, locked his elbows, and drove the patch forward into the opening. The pressure hit back like a physical force. The patch buckled slightly, then flattened as he pushed harder, using his entire body weight to align it with the hull. The sealing frame connected with the metal edge, and he felt the first vibration travel through the handle. He hammered the clamps into position, fighting the current each time the water tried to pull him off. For 3 seconds, long, silent, crushing seconds, nothing happened. Then the vibrations changed. The suction decreased, the water flow weakened, the breech began to stabilize, the frame was holding. He pressed down on the final clamp and locked it with a twist, sealing the temporary patch fully into place. The rushing sound inside the hull softened, replaced by a dull pressure thrum. The emergency alarm teams would see the pressure drop instantly. The ship was still wounded, but no longer dying. He felt his body lighten with relief, and he finally allowed himself to exhale. The patch was holding. The ship was safe for now. He signaled upward and began his slow ascent, leaving behind the silent, injured giant he had just kept afloat. The diver steadied himself for a moment, letting the faint rhythm of the battleship's massive machinery guide his breathing. Even from outside the hull, he could feel the slow, thunderous pulse of the engines, an anchor of normalcy in a world that now felt anything but normal. Every few seconds, a vibration rolled through the metal under his palms. It reminded him that time was still moving, that the ship above him was still alive, and that hundreds of sailors were depending on him to keep it that way. He worked methodically, moving along the jagged rupture in the hull with deliberate focus. The tear ran longer than anyone had initially believed. It wasn't simply a puncture or a dent. It was a wound, one deep enough that if water pressure increased by even a few pounds, the metal around it could collapse inward. And if that happened, no patch, no pump, and no team in the world could save the ship from flooding. His gloved hand traced the twisted metal edge, not for the first time. The cold bit through the neoprene and the movement sent a sharp pulse into his forearm. He hadn't noticed earlier how violently his muscles were trembling, whether from exertion or cold he couldn't tell. He shifted his grip, checking the stability of the temporary clamp he'd placed on the upper section. It held, but it wouldn't hold for long. He reached for the repair plate now anchored to his tool belt. The steel rectangle felt heavier underwater, its edges smooth so it could slide into place without catching on torn metal. He aligned it carefully, pressing it over the breech. The moment it touched the hull, he felt the pressure difference tug at it sharply. The ship's interior suction pulled almost like a living force. If he let go for even a second, the plate would tilt, slip, and the entire attempt would fail. He exhaled slowly and pressed harder. A deep groan echoed through the hull as the metal shifted under strain. He felt it through his chest, a vibration that rolled directly into his bones. He steadied his breathing again, syncing with the movement of the ship. The plate held firm under his grip. Now he needed to lock it into place. He reached for the magnetic anchors, heavy industrial clamps designed specifically for emergency underwater repair. Each one needed perfect placement. Too high and water pressure would slip beneath the gap. Too low and the clamps would warp the plate, creating an uneven seal that pumps could not compensate for. He attached the first anchor with deliberate care. A dull thud reverberated through the hull as it locked onto the steel. He waited for the vibration to settle before placing the second, then the third. Each one tightened the seal, pulling the patch closer against the ship's internal vacuum. The diver adjusted the alignment with measured force, checking with both hands for any sign of movement. Above him, faint and distant, another set of footsteps moved across the deck. He couldn't hear them clearly. The ship's hull carried only the broadest vibrations, but it was enough to remind him that time was short. The crew was preparing the internal pumps. They would engage them the moment he signaled. If he took too long, the water pressure would overwhelm the damaged site and the internal bulkheads would begin to strain. He secured the final clamp, tightening it with slow rotations until the resistance became solid. Then he slid his hand along the entire patch, feeling for gaps. There were none. For the first time since he'd submerged, the possibility of success felt real. He raised his hand, gave the signal line 2 sharp tugs and waited. A deep rumble vibrated through the hull as the pumps activated inside the ship. The suction increased instantly. The plate pulled tighter against the steel, sealing itself under the ship's own internal force. The diver held onto the nearest brace to keep from being drawn into the patch with it. Seconds passed, then more. The ship creaked, strained, shifted in the water and stabilized. A single burst of air bubbles escaped from the lowest edge of the patch, tiny, then thinning, then gone. He waited, counting the seconds in his head, monitoring the hull for any new vibrations. Nothing new, the seal held. He placed his palm flat against the metal. It felt steady, secure, alive. He let his body relax for the first time since entering the water. His heart rate slowed. The cold seeped in more clearly now, reminding him just how long he had been submerged. But the patch was in place. The ship was no longer flooding. The impossible repair had worked. He turned toward the ascent line, guiding himself upward with slow, controlled movements. The surface shimmered above him, a blurred silver mirror rippling with the motion of the waves. As he rose, the battleship's enormous shadow stretched beneath him, no longer sinking, no longer listing. It was steady, it was safe. And it would sail again. When he broke the surface, the crew rushed to the railings, their voices carrying across the wind. He couldn't hear their words clearly, but he could hear one thing unmistakably: the sound of a ship still alive, a ship he had given a second chance. A ship saved not by equipment, not by engineering, but by the resolve of one diver who refused to let hundreds of sailors die. He let the crew pull him aboard, his legs almost too weak to stand. The deck was warm beneath him, the noise overwhelming after the muffled quiet of the deep. Someone clapped his shoulder, someone else cheered. The captain himself stepped forward, his face lined with exhaustion and something else, gratitude. The diver didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The patched hull below them said everything. The diver's lungs were burning now, each second underwater stretching longer than the last. He felt the cold metal vibrate beneath his gloves as the battleship's pumps struggled to keep pace with the flooding. Every thud of machinery echoed through the hull like a deep heartbeat. The ship was alive, fighting for survival, but losing ground with each minute. He knew he had only one chance to place the final reinforcement strip. Without it, the patch might hold for a moment, maybe two, but it would never survive the pressure once the crew tried to bring the pumps to full capacity. The temporary repair would rip clear off and the ship would roll and sink long before rescue arrived. Everyone aboard trusted that he could finish what he started. Failure simply wasn't an option. He braced himself against the buckled section of hull, one hand gripping a structural rib, the other guiding the curved panel into place. Water roared past him like a river, forcing its way through the jagged hole just inches from his helmet. The power of it was immense. One mistake and he would be pulled inside the rupture, crushed between torn steel plates long before he could surface. He leaned his shoulder into the patch, anchoring it with every bit of strength left in his arms. The adhesive mixture heated onboard, mixed at the last second, and designed to react instantly to salt water, expanded across the metal like a living thing. Its chemical foam hardened on contact, spreading into the cracks around the tier and sealing areas that even the diver's hands couldn't reach. But one edge still fluttered in the current. One edge that could fail. He reached up to secure it, only for the ship to shudder violently as another internal bulkhead gave way somewhere deeper inside. The shockwave rattled the hull and sent a burst of water exploding through the opening. The diver was slammed backward, tether rope straining as it snapped tight against his harness. For 2 seconds he couldn't tell which way was up. The ocean spun around him in a storm of bubbles and debris. His hands clawed through the water until they brushed against the outer hull again, the familiar cold steel guiding him back into position. He forced himself to breathe calmly, even as the suit's regulator hissed in warning. He saw the patch ahead of him still intact, but lifting at one corner, pulsing like a heartbeat with every wave. If it tore free, the ship would flood instantly. He kicked forward and pinned the loose metal with his forearm. Then, using his last reserve of strength, he pressed the binding strip across the edge and locked it down. The chemical seal flared white as it bonded, the foam expanding outward until the entire surface stiffened beneath his palm. This was it. The moment he'd been fighting toward since he dropped into the water. The patch held. The vibration in the hull began to change, a subtle shift, a deep settling, the metal adjusting under stabilizing pressure. The pumps were catching up, the flooding was slowing, the ship was no longer dying, it was breathing again. He gave the signal tug on his line. 3 pulls, patch secure, haul me up. The crew on deck reacted instantly. The winch spun, drawing him upward toward the faint shafts of sunlight cutting through the green depths. As he rose, he kept one hand pressed to the hull, feeling for any vibration, any tremor, any hint of structural failure. The patch remained firm, resisting the waves and the suction of the still draining compartments inside. By the time he broke the surface, the chaos above had transformed. The panicked shouts had shifted to sharp commands, coordinated and confident. Sailors were running valves, checking gauges, sealing doors. Officers leaned over the rail watching him emerge, their faces a mixture of disbelief and relief. He pulled himself onto the platform, water streaming from his suit, and looked toward the midsection of the ship, the place that should have been underwater by now. Instead, it was level, stable, alive. The diver didn't celebrate. He simply nodded toward the repair site. "Get the pumps to full," he said, voice muffled inside the helmet. "She'll hold." And for the first time since the blast tore through the hull, the crew truly believed she would.